parents are the ultimate advocates. They do that out of love and concern and support.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Hi, I am April Regester, and I am a department chair at the College of Education at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. And I'm a department chair where we focus on educator preparation and leadership. But my background in terms of my position is special education, including individuals, supporting individuals with autism. And I've been in St. Louis, Missouri for about 11 years now, and have lived in New York and California and Florida and Texas.
You've been around the world a little bit.
A little bit.
Well, my name is Loretta Casper, and I am a resident of Italia Senior Living in Westlake. And I've been here about 3 years, and I just to identify myself, I do have a background in nursing education.
Oh, great.
So I am curious about autism because I hadn't spent a lot of time in understanding that issue. So I have some questions, and again, probably don't know all of the questions, so you may want to add something that I don't know, but I guess what I'd like to start with is, what is autism? And I think there are degrees of it as well.
Yeah, I miss, Loretta, what you said in terms of your education background. What was that?
I am a nursing educator.
Nursing educator.
For about 30 years.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Awesome. Well, I think your question about what is autism is a really, really good one, because I think we're still really kind of figuring out a lot about autism. And the big thing to know, it is considered a developmental disability. And so what that means when I say that, it's recognized in kind of all of the diagnostic Bibles, and that's called the DSM-5. It's recognized in that as a developmental disability that essentially it's a characteristic base. So people are not diagnosed with like a blood test or some sort of, a chromosomal or a DNA test. That's not how people get that diagnosis. Instead, you would meet with an evaluator or a certain kind of medical doctor who would be looking for someone to have an impact in their communication. So it's pretty much three things: that they're having difficulty with communication, that they also express difficulty or differences in social interactions, and oftentimes will have restricted interests or kind of repetitive behaviors that might limit them from interacting with other people. So those are the three things that oftentimes are what someone who is diagnosing someone with autism are looking for. And it's not just one of those things, but all of those things together. So a lot of times people might say, well, I have difficulty with social interactions, but they might not have difficulty with communication. And so that's why they wouldn't necessarily be given that diagnosis. So it's the combination of those three things, and it is a spectrum, like you mentioned. You said there's kind of a range, and that would include lots of different ways that people might be impacted. So their difficulty in communication might be that they don't speak verbally. But then another person might have difficulty with communication by understanding nonverbal communication, like facial expressions. And so it's a big, big range. And so I like to just simply say, if you've met one person with autism, then you've met one person with autism. There's not really one specific person with autism that can be compared to another one, just like the human, spectrum. So every person is different, including individuals with autism, but these are the three different things that oftentimes might be impacting them in terms of receiving that diagnosis.
Is that why parents become concerned when their child doesn't talk at a certain age development?
Yeah,
Is that one of the characteristic signs that someone gets concerned about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes, do you have children, Loretta?
I have 4.
You have 4 children.
6 grandchildren.
So I know you know what I mean when I say
Yes,
that kids will do all of those developmental milestones at different times. It's kind of on a range, so not every child says their first words at exactly 6 months of age, or it's all kind of different. And so I think oftentimes by the time a child might be 2, if they're experiencing difficulty in communicating with their peers or expressing verbal language in their home language, that is oftentimes something that they might go to their pediatrician, and the pediatrician might request a screening to ask some other questions and see if there's also a concern in these other areas. But that's not always the case. There's this big range in terms of child development that we're oftentimes seeing. But that you are absolutely right, that is something that you hear more and more
parents. A red flag that I hear people talk about. I have one question related to that. Is there any relationship between the perceptual development and those developmental issues that a child goes through of hand muscle, eye control, speech? Is that any way related to autistic behavior, or do they look at those perceptual development issues?
I think you're onto something there when you say that there's relationships, but we're not sure what those relationships are, right? So like there's a correlation sometimes, but we don't know what the cause is. So is that potentially that child has been given a diagnosis of autism, or is it an environmental reason, that they live in a certain location, or they have resources available to them that other children don't? And so it's a little bit tricky to connect the dots on some of those things, because it could be many, many different reasons that we see those relationships. But I think that a lot of research is happening on those for sure. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious what in your background with education, in terms of nursing in your career, that you think back, like what do you know? What were your first kind of interactions of hearing about autism? What do you recall?
Well, actually, I studied pediatric nursing, but of course I never taught it nor worked in it. I had a child with perceptual development issues and needed to be treated. It was a very successful, I was very happy with it. And there was some discussion of autism initially. So the perceptual development was erratic. So like in a verbal capacity of a 5-year-old at 3, but a hand-eye control coordination of 2. And so we had a big difference. So that was many years ago. He's now 52 and he's got a wonderful job with the bank. And but we went through all of that the issues, and I was really concerned about it as a parent, so that he could have the best he could have. And so it was a good experience for me too, to learn some of those things and follow up with them. And one thing that was interesting about that is that I wanted it to be evaluated more than they wanted it to be evaluated, being the parent. And so somebody said to me when he was in the 5th grade, because I took him every year, "Mrs. Casper, do not bring this child back. He's smart enough to have a secretary, so they can write for him." And, I needed to hear that because I was one of those doting mothers. So
Yep.
I think when you're a mother and you have a concern about your child, it's an overwhelming experience.
Absolutely.
Especially if you're a nurse, they have everything, and we're the worst. So that's why I asked you that question, because I think in my mind, they would overlap somewhat, especially if we don't know the cause.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be my concern about it. So, so it's misunderstood. Probably the whole thing is misunderstood and what it is. So everybody gets worried about what it is and how to treat it and how successful the child is. That seems to be the parents. Now, when you talk about spectrum, you're talking about degrees of autism. Is that how you would phrase that when you talk about autism spectrum?
Yeah, when I say autism spectrum, it's not necessarily degrees, because when you think of a degree, there's always like a definite
a level of type.
Yeah. And I don't think of it in that, it's not that finite. And so instead, I think of it in terms of presentation, right? So like when someone has if I have a cold and my husband has the same cold, we present differently in terms of that cold. So maybe for me, that cold has my nose all stuffed up and it's really bothering me when I sleep at night. For him, he has the same cold, but for him, he has really bad sinus headache. So it's presenting differently for different people. And I think of that spectrum in terms of autism in the same way that someone has received that diagnosis, and we know how they received it because we talked about those three things that they are maybe having difficulty with. However, they present differently on all of those. So what is a misunderstanding is a lot of times people do think that I hear this word all the time and it makes me kind of cringe. You hear low functioning and high functioning. And why that's really not the best way to think about it is that someone might have difficulty with social interactions, but they're really skillful at how they communicate. And so when you have all of these combinations of ways that you present yourself, if you get categorized in kind of one box, then oftentimes it limits you in terms of building upon your skills.
So it's a bit elusive. You can't get to that answer at all then, because and parents would be looking for how well their child is going to develop.
Yes.
Or there will be a increased development in one area and a decrease in another possibility. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
And as a parent, I mean, I love your own experience with this, because really what parents are looking for when they have that, because you're right, parents are concerned and they are the ultimate advocates. Parents have led us to every initiative in programming and law and resources and supports around developmental disabilities have originated by parents. Parents have done the work. And so they do that out of love and concern and support for their children. And what it all boils down to is sometimes we get stuck on what is autism, like how does someone receive the diagnosis? When will they, will they achieve a certain level or degree on a spectrum? That's kind of where we get stuck. But the reality is that the best outcomes come from the supports received, right? So in your story, it sounds like the same thing, that regardless of your son having that diagnosis or not, he actually received some services and supports that helped him to achieve what you described as a very successful, man today, right? And those supports and services were what made the difference, not the fact that he had the diagnosis, right? The diagnosis allows him access to the supports. So getting him evaluated so that we can identify what is going to be really helpful to teach him in school, to help him at home, to strategies that you might have learned as a parent, or strategies that teachers learn when they go to their teacher education programs. Those are the things that make the difference. The diagnosis provides access to those things, in terms of financial access or access in schools and public schools. So that is helpful to get the diagnosis so that it opens those doors. But once you have those doors open, it really doesn't tell you much, because what tells you much is my son had difficulty reading facial expressions. And so once we know that information and know what the difficulty is, then we can work on ways to teach him how to recognize people's facial expressions and what those facial expressions mean. Or my son was really, really good at his typewritten communication. He could type out wonderful essays at school, but he had difficulty in verbal communication. So that tells us, what could we do to support him in learning how to verbally
Let me give you an example of that. My son did very poorly on a time test. And so the teacher in the 4th grade recognized that. So she would test him verbally.
Yeah.
And I was delighted, because when you think of those years way back when, people did not do that individual evaluations. And especially, we were in a private school at the time. And so the principal said to me, well, we do not give individual instruction. We give group instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, he's here. So, what are we going to do for him? And I was upset to think that there wasn't that encouragement when she took it upon herself to do that, because his grade was good. It's just that when he had that pressure of time, he didn't function.
Yep.
And I was forever grateful to her,
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
Because I was still in the dark all those years ago about which way to go with him. And even had some pushback from family members that said, well, what's wrong with him? Nothing. I just want him to have some success in life, was my goal. But it's hard for the parent.
Oh, yeah.
Because you make up things that will probably never happen. So, because you don't know.
Yeah.
So it's the unknown for that. I had some other questions related to, if you have a good friend that's autistic, or your sister or brother or somebody, is there well, I think I can answer this maybe, because if there's some way you should act in relation to their, I don't want to use their deficit, but their need, then how would you know that? And, what would you do? Because if there was something strange, not as common as in others, you wouldn't react at all. You wouldn't know what to do.
Yeah.
So what
I
do you
love
do?
that question, or that thought. And I love how you think about how you're, thinking about this. Like, it's not a deficit, and it supports or needs that someone might have. That's
exactly.
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is that, one, the initial reaction, and you see this a lot with like people out in public, right, is to look away, right, or kind of not say anything, and you just kind of ignore, right? And I would argue that is not the best approach. So if you have a family member, someone that's very close to you, then I would say you want to presume what's called presuming competence. So you want to assume that family, including that child, wants to be engaged in a part of whatever the family activities and whatever you would do, just like everyone else in your family. So you always want to presume competence of that child and the inclusiveness of that family, because you don't want to isolate the child or the other family members, the parents and siblings, because you're unsure on how to interact. And so you always want to make sure that you're being very inclusive. So if you have family gatherings,
You see them as somebody different. You see them as
Yeah.
wellness.
yes. And then I would say it's being very, very, very open and asking questions. So I think what we do is we are afraid to ask questions because we think we're being rude or disrespectful. And it's just how questions are framed, right? So you think of yourself as a parent back at that time when you were maybe trying to figure out how to support your son. And the difference between a question of saying, what's wrong with him, right? That's one question someone might have asked you, compared to how can I help you? What could I do to accommodate you? So like the teacher accommodated your son by reading aloud those questions, and you talk about what a big difference that made for you and him. And so those accommodations can be done in any situation, family gatherings, going out for dinner. And it could be as simple as maybe having a nice quiet space in your home for a child to be able to relax in when you invite a family, over for an event, right? And that could easily be arranged for someone if someone needs to have a little space because there's a lot of stimulation happening. And so as the family member or close friend, you want to reframe your questions, not to say things like, what's wrong with your child, or what that deficit language, but instead say, what could I do to help you participate in this event? Or what could I do to help support you or your child? Or what accommodations might be helpful when you come over to my house, or we go out to dinner, or we do something. And I think that is the difference, because then they might say, oh man, I'd really love to attend, but we couldn't because they like a certain kind of food and it's difficult for them to stay away from that food when it's all spread out on a table. And that's a simple solution. We'll put tops on everything, or we'll keep food up in a certain location. Those are easy accommodations that would make things easier and include that family and that child. And so just reframing the questions, but don't be afraid to ask them. I think any parent would love that kind of communication to them. Don't say things like, what's wrong with them?
Wouldn't think that.
Yeah.
Because they would be stopped by whatever they might see and feel incompetent themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so often you see that there's a special child, or that child can't go to the wedding, or that child can't do this, or the parent will speak for the child.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the child doesn't have a chance to say, because we assume something's wrong, therefore everything's wrong.
Yes.
So maybe we can kind of come to that conclusion. What causes this?
I think that is a one of the questions, like in what I do, I get asked the most. And I have to say, I have to be really, really honest. In my career and like the things that I do, I don't even like that question is like it's not something I think about, right? Because I'm really focused on what we do.
Help.
Yeah, I think about what we do to support, and how I help teachers teach, and how I help families manage their homes and manage, including their child. I think about those sort of things, and I'm not concerned about the cause, because oftentimes when we talk about cause, the reason people want to know cause is they want to identify a cure. And what I do know is, just from being human, that if someone was trying to cure a very important, critical part of who I was, that would feel really weird to me. So unlike some sorts of, even though autism spectrum disorder, right? The word disorder implies that there's this kind of like medical, like magic to this, right? That we're going to take some blood.
Well, you immediately think of the central nervous system.
Yeah, you think of something.
You would think of that as being some aberration in that developmental process, as an embryo. You might be thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
And then
back in the day, they would
another
blame
child like that.
Yeah.
It answers all kinds of questions that you can't get to the answer.
Yep.
You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Yeah.
Exactly. And that's really challenging. It's challenging for families because you're navigating a medical view that there is not a medical response or answer to it. There is no one, there's not a shot for autism that, and I would argue that oftentimes the people that I know who identify as having autism, that's like the beautiful part of them, right? There's something really awesome about the students that I teach, and it is not, they view that as something as a strength to who they are, because maybe they do have maybe a restricted interest in a certain area, which makes them excel in that area. It helps them to be the best at what they do. You know, very, very cool things come out of having that identity. And so I'm really, really cognizant of the fact that I really don't have a desire to cure autism at all. I have a desire to identify supports that I think would benefit a much larger group of people, not just people who have a diagnosis of autism. Because if we talk about difficulty in communicating, if I identify a lot of cool strategies that help people with their communication, that benefits all kinds of people. That's not just people with autism. So I kind of focus on those areas. Now, if you talk to a medical professional, they might provide you an answer of, we're not quite sure. We do know that there's a combination of genetic components and environmental,
Exposure.
exposure, but they're not quite sure what that combination is. So, or if one triggers the other, or, so there's a lot of research on that, but I really, really, and I think research is a fabulous thing. I research things, I just am very careful in the fact that we know a lot of people out there who have a really positive, like a strong identity, like they call themselves autistic and say, that is cool part of who I am. Just like saying I'm a woman, or I'm a man, or I am, a professor or a nurse. That's a strong identity for them. And so to imply that we want to cure or fix who they are makes me feel sad. Instead, I like to think about what I can do to help them feel like boost supports and services. That
so we're looking at it, we're in a positive way. I can give you an example of that. My granddaughter told me that she was dating someone that was autistic, and he shared that with her when she's 17, and he's also an Olympic swimmer and won some type of international award. So that's a perfect example of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it takes it away from a deficit, like something's wrong with you.
Yeah.
You're developing in another direction. And interesting enough, there's always something wrong with all of us somewhere.
Exactly.
That we haven't developed and probably never will.
Yep.
Because we don't like it or we don't want to, or something's wrong. So it's a whole different approach to looking at that child. And of course, their psychological development is so dependent on feeling part of the world and part of their life and part of the family, and not different than, that to me is the good news of that type of approach.
Yeah, I agree.
That child is, that person is normal, so to speak, for them.
Yeah, kind of along those lines.
I'm sure there's prominent figures or historic figures that have had autism that people don't know who they are. You're probably familiar with them?
Yeah, I mean, there's speculation now in hindsight of people who have passed, right? So Albert Einstein would be one of the most famous individuals that people now report. He probably would, according to like the technical terms, been provided a diagnosis of autism. But then what's cool about that is I think in the past we've had like media representation that primarily focused on that deficit, and now we're seeing like really cool things about positive representation. And I would say across the board, representation of females in CEO positions, a representation of people with autism in prominent areas, in society, representation of people of color who are, in the Oscars. So you hear like different types of representation, and disability and autism would be part of that story, that we're seeing a difference in the importance of that in movies, in film, in television, and everyday jobs. So an example would be, do you know who Elon Musk is?
Yes, I heard the name, but I don't know the background. So.
Yeah, I think he's very wealthy. Let's put it that way. He's an entrepreneur. I think he invented like Tesla.
Why don't we know him better?
And he actually identifies as a person with autism, and so there's people now who, rather than speculating from the past that someone had autism, there are people now who actually own that as part of their identity, and very, very admirable positions in our society, whether they're acting, whether they're, in politics, whether they're an entrepreneur like him, one of the most wealthiest men in the world, Now, I think that is pretty cool, because we're seeing a shift of that identity as being not something to be ashamed of, that, instead it's kind of owned as an asset. And people would probably argue that having autism would be what led him to be so successful in his kind of entrepreneurship. He probably had some restricted interests there that really helped him to hone, how to make a really good car.
So what you're saying though is, over the past, maybe 10 or 15 years, there's been a greater interest in awareness and ownership of the, are we calling it an illness or a disorder, or what are we calling it?
I think most people who are using that positive based language, they will just say autism, and they don't necessarily have to have an it behind it. So they'll just say, I have autism, similar to like you saying, I have arthritis sometimes, or I wear glasses, or I have short hair versus long hair. It's just kind of a characteristic of the person. So
we're not talking as if something's wrong.
Yep.
It's just, we're talking as if this is me.
Yeah. It's a part of who someone is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when do you think that shift occurred?
Well, I think
we started looking at IEPs and all these developmental testing, and like special. My sister's an educator, and she's always talking about IEPs and a special organization. And I'm thinking, well, I'll never remember that, but I am older, a lot older. And so I thought maybe some of it came about because we started looking at individuals in their style of learning.
Oh, absolutely. I think you probably didn't experience it because you said your child went to a private school.
Yes.
And so in 1975, there was a law at the time that was passed that required that children with disabilities had access to a free and appropriate education in public schools. Prior to 1975, that law didn't exist. So kids with disabilities, oftentimes, that's why we saw so much institutional living for kids with disabilities, because they were just kind of shipped someplace, or there was no school. Their siblings went off to school, but they didn't. And so in 1975, that law was passed, and that's the law that built in ways to support kids, which was the development of an IEP. And I definitely agree with you. That was the start, because we were saying that children with disabilities had a right to things that children without disabilities have a right to education, a right to transportation, access to schools,
Yes. Let me just share with you, my son went to a public school for kindergarten. And there was a summer program for children with developmental disabilities. So if you got over 35 score on some test, pre-test they gave them, then you couldn't be part of this. Well, he was going on to a private school after this, but he got 36 instead.
Mhm.
He needed 35. So they called and said he didn't qualify. I said, well, yes, he does. He said, well, but the cutoff is 35. I said, I don't really care if it's, 35. He's part of the system. I'm part of the system here. I pay my taxes.
Yep.
I'm entitled to this. I even got into why, because I'm going to a private school. I mean, I was trying to find 25 different things on why I could send him to this, because it had transportation. It had a day broken up with hand-eye coordination, gross muscle motor development. It had all those kinds of things
Yeah.
that he needed. And I thought, well, we've got to do this.
Yeah.
So of course I asked her to reconsider and went through all the whole thing. And he did go. And
Good.
it was very nice because he told me all the things he did. And I thought, wow, because, we were paying for private care for him. And then, of course, in our Diocese of Cleveland, we didn't. When we got older, we had him followed up, and that was the person who told me never to come back to her, that he'd be fine in life. So I did have that experience with not being able to participate because of where we went to school. So I said, oh, so if I send him into your school, you'll take him. That doesn't seem right to me. I am a citizen of this county, so. So it was a bit of a struggle, but he was born in 1968. So that was, he was just falling right into that a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting how that was definitely the start. The 70s was the start of what we refer to as pretty big movements in the disability community. And then we've continued to change that. And that law was in 1975. But what a lot of people don't realize is that law required that kids have access to education that have disabilities. But it wasn't until 1990 that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And that law, that law actually talked about things like buildings and public spaces and being able to call 911 if you were someone who was deaf. Lots of different things that people don't even realize. In 1990, it really is not that long ago. So we went from 1975 to 1990, where we said, okay, you need to educate kids with disabilities, but we don't have buildings where they can be educated because some people couldn't access them. Yeah. You think of old buildings in big cities, right? In Cleveland, right? There's big old buildings with big steps all the way up to the front. Yes. So some children who maybe had mobility needs couldn't even get into the school where they're supposed to get the access. So that's why we saw a lot of segregated schooling for kids with disabilities between 1975 and 1990. Not necessarily because those kids shouldn't have been included in schools that existed, but simply because they could not access. So we had to build new buildings. We had to, and so oftentimes the education system that we see today is not for the reasons that people think. People assume that kids with disabilities need to be educated separately because they need something different. But a lot of times it was just a product of where we were at in that time in history that kind of set those things in stone. But I love your story because your story is just the epitome of all of this, right? The parents have paved the way for all of those laws. Parents were the ones that said, my child has a right to access the things that support him to help him learn, to help him be successful. And when I go to new places, I said I've moved all around. I gravitate to find the parents who I call my people, because they're the ones that are at the heart of what needs to happen next. What is the next phase of this movement, which we're kind of in the middle of the movement that's shifting from that medical view to a positive service-oriented and support-oriented view of really highlighting the great things about individuals with autism and what can we do to strengthen and boost their skills and support them in weaknesses, just like all of us. You said we all have our challenges, right? So,
just reminded me of of something I was thinking as you were talking. So many times when you have a child, you want the perfect child. And then when you don't, it's such a disappointment. And therefore, then you realize all their life they're not perfect. Yeah, and not only are they not perfect, but they could have something drastically wrong eternally. So you don't see it as positive. So I think, how do we educate people like that? Because it's how they look at life.
Yeah.
Well, how do you start looking at a mom who has a baby with some type of disability?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because she will transfer all that off to that child.
Yeah. Exactly.
Unless we do something there. Are there any, well, I'm sure if someone's seeking treatment, that's part of the program at treatment, I would assume.
Yeah.
I'm not review your child, I don't know, but it sounds like reasonable.
Yeah, so I think parent support, and I oftentimes we want to make sure that people, parents and doctors and people in those fields that are supporting young families, like, or pregnant mothers, right? Yes. We want to hit people early with examples of what life looks like for an adult with autism. And so oftentimes we only see what we see on TV or what we remember from our own childhood, like the first film I saw, you know, my only interaction as when I was a young child and we knew a neighbor had autism. So we want to dispel any of those kind of things, because that's all you know. Then instead, having them interact with adults with disabilities, including those with autism, to see that, hey, Elon Musk has autism. Is that so bad? You know, like
he got married and, you know.
Yeah. Great television shows.
Is there a genetic transfer to that autistic, a genetic transfer to, in other words, if I had a child with autism and he or she married, is there some type of genetic connection?
I think that's a really good question. And there isn't anything that a marker. So if you look at DNA, oftentimes they'll talk about markers, and we can say you have a marker or you're a carrier for something. There isn't something like that. However, what we do see is that people in families you're more likely to have a child with autism. If you have one, you're more likely to have another child. You're more likely
for that. What are they defending that with?
Well, keep in mind that diagnosis is characteristic based. So there's a lot of questions here. So is that because the parent is seeking out those evaluations and they're hyper aware of potential, you know, needs? It could be the parent is just a very strong advocate to make sure that their child gets needs, right? Is it because you know, there's lots of different reasons, but we don't have a marker for DNA, but we do see that there's more likelihood in within certain families, and you know, so future we might
find that relationship.
Oh, I mean, research is great, and so I think I'm sure we will. It's what we do with that information that I'm more concerned about. So, you know, we know that there is a chromosome that impacts someone having the diagnosis of Down syndrome. Yes. And what we do with that information can be very different. You know, you can see different approaches. Some people will screen early in pregnancy for Down syndrome, and then they do genetic counseling that would include the option for the mother to potentially abort the baby. Now, that isn't an issue in political sense on whether or not abortion is good or bad, right? That is more of an issue of, if you want to have a child and you've determined you would like to have a child, are you going to abort the baby because the baby has a diagnosis of Down syndrome? And that is the issue where I really like to get involved, is what do we do with the information? So it's really helpful perhaps for families to know that they're going to have a child with Down syndrome so they can prepare and learn about it. meet adults with Down syndrome, learn about services and supports. So that's where I think we need to do a lot more of, rather than thinking it's something wrong and there is no level of success for an individual with Down syndrome, because I know that's not true. And so it's more about what we do with the information we find. If we do find a marker or DNA carrier status for autism, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to do something to eradicate or cure autism? Or are we going to use that to provide information and awareness in services and supports so that people can gain better access to those, and we continue to have the wonderful spectrum of people and humanity that we have currently? So that's the tension that we kind of see with disability in general, I would say, is, what do we do with the information that we obtain?
Well, you have competing values there.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
What do you choose? I think.
Yeah. And I don't have the answers to that.
Sometimes it's better not knowing.
Yeah. Arguably, someone could disagree with me. And I think that's kind of the beauty of humanity, right? It's just kind of what I think about a lot. And there's examples in history where we've, disability, polio, right? Polio is a disability. And we've essentially have cured polio. But we have prominent figures in our society today who identify as having polio, and would they feel that that's something that they would have wanted cured? It's an interesting question. Judy Heumann is a huge disability activist who's worked within the White House and various administrations. She had polio, which led to her disability. I don't know. I've never asked her that question. I don't know if others have, but it's an interesting thought. Her life and career and her prominence in this world has been based around her experience of having polio. I can't imagine life without Judy Heumann. But we essentially now, children do not experience polio and do not have the associated disabilities from it.
Well, it's certainly been a very interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it.
I've loved talking with you. I think it's so interesting to hear your background and how little the parent perspective has changed.
I even had people saying, my mother-in-law saying, why do you focus so much on their development? And we kept one of our other son back a year because he was an August birthday, and he did have some difficulty focusing. Mm-hmm. And we also had him treated as well. And she said, he's such a big boy. Why do you keep him back? And I said to her, because I like a big smart boy. Instead of a big one that isn't so smart. I didn't know what to say to her because I thought, I didn't think size had a darn thing to do with it, He was tall, but I didn't care. He just didn't seem like children would be a year older than him. Yeah. And his development was very much in the middle. And I used to have him do hand-eye coordination and send them upstairs to get 2 things and then send them back to get 3 things, and that type of thing to develop that auditory perception type thing. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah. And see, you were making sure he got what he needed. And
well, I thought that there had to be something out there for him. So he's okay today too.
So the irony here is, I think I was asked to do this, as the expert on autism, but I think I always call, when I have meetings with parents and families, the parents are the experts. They really are. The child or the individual themselves is the biggest expert on who they are. So you always seek to get that information from them first. And then it's parents. Parents are the experts. So I can go to school, I can learn all sorts of things and have great conversations, but I know who the experts are.
I
You're
had
the
a charge
expert
with my
here.
son, the first one with the had some issues. And he thanked me for taking him to Mr. Colas, which was literally 48 years ago.
Mhm.
And he thanked me for doing that. And it kind of shocked me, I thought, oh my gosh. So he must see that evident in his life
Yeah.
somewhere, but he still is the one that does things too quickly. And that was his initial problem.
There is no perfect
But
child.
he's managed. Oh, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Is there anything else that we missed here? I think
you covered everything.
we did, unless there's something that you would like to say that,
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
and I enjoyed it too, very much. Thank you. Best wishes to you.
And I think to myself,